Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about how to effectively make data-driven decisions. And joining us to contribute to the conversation is Tarush Agarwal. Welcome.
Hey, Joanna, thank you so much for having me on the show. Looking forward to being here and hopefully adding some value to your audience.
That's great. Do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself? Give a little
Yeah.
background.
So my background, I've been fortunate enough to spend my career in the data realm. Got to be one of the first data engineers at Salesforce.com back in 2011. Before a lot of folks in the valley had a data team. There weren't really many companies which had data engineers or data scientists back then. And then most recently, I led data for WeWork. Joined pretty early with the data team, was a few people, helped scaled it up to over 100 people. Jump started you know, different avenues in data, like the sort of platform data engineering, and found myself in Bali, Indonesia, at the beginning of lockdown. I was stuck there at the beginning of COVID, and I got to take some time off the valley in New York. And what I found is that majority of companies are really in the next 5 years going to be on what we call the modern data stack and being more data driven, and not a lot of them are going to have the opportunity of hiring 50 100 people like we work in Salesforce. So what I'm very interested in now is how do we get every business the same level of analytics as some of the big tech players.
Yeah, so let's start there. You'll hear executives all the time say we need to make data-driven decisions. Well, let's start with what that even means. So,
Yeah,
what does that mean to you?
sure. So if you look at the evolution, right, like 10 years ago is when digital marketing really started becoming popular. So 10 years ago, no one really had websites. It wasn't that relevant. And this small company called Google comes along and says there's something called search. And if you don't have a digital presence, you're not going to exist. And how businesses have evolved is having an online digital presence, starting to understand what your customers are saying about your product. What being data driven is now is the evolution of this, right? We no longer sell in one place. Your typical go to market strategy, you now have online, offline, referrals, affiliates, SEO, different search engines, social. So it's become a lot more than just a single go to market channel. So understanding how are you converting across your different channels, where do you want to double down on, but also understanding what's your ideal customer profile and what channels are helping you find more of your ideal customer profile than instead of just I spent X, I got Y. Understanding your sort of segments, what your what your customer lifetime value is. How do you personalize your app or your product for your different segments so that you can increase engagement? Increase engagement is decrease churn. And then how do you automate some of your financial dashboards? How do you automate more and more parts of your supply chain, or for instance, more of your customer support, so you're not sort of having higher operational costs. So these broad set of capabilities which really revolve around go to market strategy, increasing engagement, and optimizing the business, being able to get very good at these is really what we're seeing as what the sort of general definition of data driven is.
Well, so I think, in my mind, I think the very first thing that companies should probably do is ask themselves some really good questions. Do you have some suggestions on what, if companies are headed down this path of we need to make more data driven decisions, what should they be asking themselves of like problem they're trying to solve even?
Kind of going back down to the first three areas, right, which is where are our customers coming from? Let's focus on go to market strategy. How do we, can we first, the first step is being able to access this information, and spending 1 or 2 weeks and manually building a report is no longer good enough, right? Like when you have more data driven organizations able to empower everyone in the organization to answer any question they have in a self-service manner in real time, how's an organization like that going to compare with an organization where some analyst or someone is like building a sort of manual report at the end of every month, the sort of former is just going to move much quicker, right? So it's not just on what are the questions to ask, but do we have the right infrastructure, do we have the right frameworks in place to, when we do ask these questions, to be able to then generate these questions and answers on a more automated level and decrease the time it takes from answering a question to be able to answer it. But sort of going back to what you said, the sort of question I would really answer are sort of around three areas, right? Number one is how do we kind of get more customers? So what's happening inside our go-to-market? Number two is, what are we doing to engage these customers and sort of retain them? And then number three is how do we start to, pay attention to the way our business operates in terms of increasing operational efficiency, which is ultimately decreasing burn.
And then where do they go from there? I mean, so there, I guess this could go in a lot of directions. One, you can look at the systems you currently have, and what are the challenges there? Like it just saying, all right, now we have this big question that we need to answer, and we want to use data to do it, and now we have disparate systems. Or so where do
Yeah.
you go? What do you do?
So, a lot of it is like building blocks, right? Where you sort of start with a foundational level and you keep adding capabilities on top of it. At a very macro level, your average business today has got between 10 to 12 different sources of data. So you have your sort of backend databases, you might have a CRM, a help desk, some payment processing, ad networks, a lot of Google Sheets, financial information. uh, your average business, your average startup today has got 10 to 12 different data sources. So it starts with how do you take this data from these different data sources, ingest it automatically into a central, what we call data warehouse, and then join it, model it, clean it, structure it in a way which makes sense for the business, and ultimately be able to surface this back to the business, right? So I just kind of mentioned five different layers, ingestion, storage, modeling, reporting. And that's really kind of your first version of this, right? And this itself is non-trivial because you have multiple different vendors and you have to go sign contracts with these different vendors, and then you have to spend a few months to sort of stitch this together. We can get into how kind of 5x helps with all of this, but that's kind of the that's sort of level one. After that, you want to get into, hey, how do we do more advanced decision making stuff? How do we start taking this intelligence which we have and pushing it back inside Salesforce so that our sales team doesn't have multiple tools to use? Or how do we push it back into a sort of marketing automation tool? That's what we call sort of reverse ETL. Then as you grow bigger, you have more and more data sets. How do we start tracking these data sets, and what's the difference in a data set which has been built by the data team and someone and another data set which somebody just downloaded and made some changes on Excel? How do we track, what are the core data sets, which ones are sort of evolved around it? That's a whole area around metadata and lineage. And then finally, you have sort of recommendations, A/B testing, machine learning, which are all again different functional areas. So there's a lot which happens, and the core reporting stuff which we spoke about is really the first few layers, or the sort of base of the pyramid.
Has there been any studies that you're aware of, or that or any indication that you have then of how much companies should spend on turning their data into a usable tool? How much
Um,
do they invest?
So, historically, it's been extremely expensive to even get started. As I kind of mentioned, the four different layers just to kind of get started, and that's pretty basic. And each of these companies is like $1 billion company now, right? So you have to go sign these five enterprise contracts. You're probably going to spend $50,000 even, just on these contracts. You need to hire, one or two engineers, and they're going to spend a few months to try and stitch them all together. So, you know, in sort of America, where the average cost of an engineer is 150 to 200K now, the idea of having two engineers and some infrastructure spend, you're in between three to $500,000 sort of just to get started. So it's 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 historically been something which only slightly larger companies can do. You raise your Series A, Series B check, and that's really when a lot of companies start their data-driven initiatives, just because it's been so expensive. Now, kind of what we're seeing, and what sort of 5x really does is allow this cost price to sort of go down exponentially, and companies for sort of between 50 60K are able to sort of build the same capabilities. And what we're seeing now is that companies are starting to do this a lot sooner. So our smallest companies using us today are doing this pre-product before they even have a product and before they have customers. They know when they want to get started, they want to be tracking the right things, they want to have the right reporting. And then obviously at the larger side of the things, we have public companies and banks using us today.
We talk about in project management a lot for executives who, looking at their portfolio, the 10-second decision. So basically having all the information that you need in front of you so that you can make a decision on your project portfolio in 10 seconds. So what is that? I mean, does that translate to what you're talking about? And then how do you actually serve up all the right, choose what the right information is then to make that possible?
Yeah, that's kind of very true, right? And the nature of data changes um, depending on the hierarchy of the organization. So what a sales manager in one city sees is very different from what the CEO sees, right? And understanding really for each level of the organization what is really required. So let's say we have a sales enablement, a sort of go to market sort of type of project. What we want to do is understand what are the different personas of customers, of internal users who are going to be part of this, and then for each of them, what are the questions they're trying to answer. So and this is at a very business level. As a sales rep in one city, I want to know what's happening in my city. I want to know what are the different products, different SKUs, what promotions are happening, which is pretty different from the head of the city, the head of the region, the sort of head of sales, the head of marketing, and the CEO. And step one is really figuring out for each of them what's needed. Working backwards, then great. In order to answer these questions, what's the data we need? Are we tracking it? If not, how do we start tracking it? How do we then ingest it, model it, structure it, build out reporting? And then on top of reporting, if there's anything needed around insights, recommendations, advanced decision making, how do we sort of action all of those? So it really starts with understanding what are the questions at a business level people are trying to answer, and then working backwards. And what happens, which is that visibility is getting visibility leads to asking better questions, and with better questions you change your understanding of what's actually happening in the business. So we see that for the first 3 4 iterations, your metrics are constantly changing as you start asking better questions. And this end to end process, because it takes a few iterations, it's something which companies would want to start on earlier, and not until hey, we need to now get more optimized, let's start doing data. In some ways that's like saying I'm just about to go on vacation, I should start going to the gym now. It takes some time before, and that's what a lot of people um, and that's what we're seeing a lot of companies struggle with.
And so what would you find, what would you think the top mistakes companies make when they go down this path?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think two areas, right? One of them is like we're gonna we we're trying to collect all of this data, but we're going to action this much later on. And that's not how it works. It takes a few iterations to sort of get started. So if you're, if it's game time in a few months, you do want to get started quite significantly before that. And the best time to really get started is as you're starting to design your product and features, because data really acts like the bridge between these sort of product and engineering teams in the business. And the sooner you have that bridge, the faster each of these teams can execute without being sort of dependent on each other. So I think that's kind of one. And then I think the second mistake a lot of companies make is that you know they might get started off in an ad hoc manner. They might even bring on an analyst and build some dashboards and build some reports, but that's really done in a very ad hoc manual way. These folks might be manually extracting data from systems, building their own reports, and not really leveraging automation and the platforms and all of this to do it. the a big mistake companies make is they think that that's really step one, and then they can build on top of that. But in reality, that setup is not something which you can build on top of. You sort of really have to get started from scratch. So if you don't have the right tools in place, it's like trying to build a skyscraper, right? You can't just throw cement and concrete and start building on top and expect that later on we're going to reinforce it. If you're looking at building something which is scalable, you need to think about bringing in the right equipment on day one and sort of digging the earth and building a foundation.
What, and that's something. So when we think about these companies who bring on, they have multiple systems, and then maybe they have an acquisition and they don't finish fully integrating them, and so then there's extra systems. Like how much more difficult is it once you're getting, to rework basically this data? I mean, is it more, I guess in my mind, it's probably cheaper to start out right than it is to tear down the house and rebuild. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
So, you know, one thing which we really focus on is being able to separate the data systems from your business systems. And what that
Mm,
really means is that how do we give the business enough flexibility to use any tool you want? Buy a
mhm.
new company, change your CRM halfway through, and not be bogged down from a reporting perspective. And we do that by being able to ingest this data from all of these different data sources. Our ingestion layer works with over 150 sort of different vendors out of the box. And if a vendor is not supported, our engineers are fully capable of building those integrations. But how do we pull pull data from anywhere into a central place? And in the central place, we can figure out how to join it, stitch it, whether you're moving from one solution to another or it's an acquisition. How does it all play nice? And how do we build on top of this raw data a clean model layer which reflects the questions you want to answer as a business? And by doing this, we're able to separate out your business systems and your core sort of engineering systems from the data world. And this gives the business more flexibility on moving very, very quickly without having to worry about what's going to happen to data reporting. So, in short, to answer your question, once you have the right foundation in place, um, it gives you a lot more flexibility. And feel free to go ahead and acquire companies and move to different tools because we'll be able to mask all of that inside the ware. We'll be able to fix all of that in the warehouse later.
You mentioned in I think your intro, you were talking about automation and some of that. So let's say you've got your data and then you've got your reports, but like how much more can you do then with your data to really make it efficient and ensure that you're really making solid decisions, timely decisions.
Yeah. Um, I think as I said kind of earlier, I think the sort of reporting layer is really part of the base of the pyramid, right? Visibility is really one of the cores, is the first thing we need, but really kind of the first step, right? Like once you have visibility, next level is really how do we start to use this intelligence or this visibility and start to push it into sort of different systems, right? So being able to push this back into your marketing automation tools for your sort of marketing team to now leverage some of this intelligence we have around the customers inside there emails or any other processes, push this back into our CRMs, use sort of decision making tools. So what a decision making tool is really good at doing is, hey, you want to increase revenue. Let's analyze to see whether location or age or cohort or any of these different variables make a difference, and being able to come back to you being like, hey, we've analyzed your data and it says you should really focus on customers in LA and in Barcelona.
Hmm.
um, what this allows us to do is go back to our marketing campaigns and figure out, hey, we're not just looking to spend $100 on Facebook and get $200 back as an ROI, but how do we get more customers from these two cities? Because we know as a product, we have higher engagement and our ideal customer profiles are from these cities. So you start getting a lot more specific in all of these different areas. And this is kind of just one example of being able to understand the data, figure out some insights. Let me give you an example of how other businesses sort of use this, right? Like
Please.
A sort of online grocery store is able to figure out that after a customer has bought from them 4 times, that they
Hmm.
become a regular customer. Mm.
Okay.
It seems like it's a very important metric because now they're very, very incentivized to give people upfront coupons and promotions and even manually having to reach out to get someone to basically transact with them 4 times because
Hmm.
they know that after that point what the data shows is that the cliff to become um, an active customer is just massively higher. So that is a level of insight which manually looking at information is never ever going to give you, but a direct way in which which sort of data driven insights are going to have a significant uh, increase in your sort of conversions and sales and sort of future revenue.
So, what are some of the most, you worked for some pretty significant companies that you just mentioned. What are some of the best case studies that you've seen come across, in working in data? Like, what are some of the most like insightful things that data led companies to be able to make, to the extent that you can talk about it, but
Yeah,
whether it's, yeah, I'd love to hear some stories.
I mean we see it all the time, right? You see it in like bigger tech companies, and it's kind of become just it's become like the sort of reputation of big tech. But anytime you're seeing sort of recommendations of like what to buy on Amazon, or Uber has got a car from you, Uber has a car a few minutes away from you at all times,
Mm,
or you are able to look at some like products, some ads on Instagram, and a lot of them might be exactly sort of what you're looking for, or you're able to go into you're able to go into a particular online store and really find clothes which really kind of make sense for you sort of pretty soon. All of these are sort of enabled by organizations being extremely data driven, understanding that they have different segments of users, and that segment one is very different from segment two, understanding their behaviors, and then being able to personalize their product for each of these for each of these segments. And kind of going back, right, the first step of this would be from a very reporting perspective, understanding your segments, understanding the behaviors of each segments, and then trying out for each segments, A/B testing to see which flow or which products make more sense, being able to get a better understanding, and then ultimately being able to provide sort of recommendations and insights, which are then customer facing inside your product and app. So, going down that pyramid, sort of really how do you start from, basically understanding segmentation all the way up to like recommendations and insights. And that's that entire journey.
and
Does that make
I'm sorry.
I was just asking if that made
Oh,
sense.
yeah, yeah. um I just, for me, data feels a little overwhelming in the sense that there's so much good information out there, but I don't know how to use it. And it feels like that's what really you bring to light, and that process is really going through the user personas, and starting from there and working down to where, like, what does the person need down to where the data is did I understand that right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, no one is doing data for the sake of building a data team. Uh,
Right.
it's always a means to optimize the business. And,
Mm,
whereas, software engineering teams in some ways, like you just need software engineering teams to go build a product. It's like binary, right? If you don't have this, you can't build a product. If you have it, you can. Whereas with data teams, we're always looking at ROI. What can data do to optimize the business, which is going to either bring us more money, save us money, or help us spend less money, right? Very often when we have businesses with saying, hey, we're trying to cut costs and make the business more efficient, my first question to them is, great, how many more data people are we hiring, right? So, if the goal is always sort of around optimizing the business, we bring technology and we bring resources and people, but ultimately what we're really focused on is how do you make you more efficient as a business. And it's not to bring on more complexity and say there are like 50, 100 other things we have to do, but how do we use what we have to simplify to give you, very clear insights of these are the one, two, three things we want to start doing immediately, which are going to bring us the best ROI. So
Have you, do you have any stories where maybe you were, the data was meant to be used one way, but then it led to some surprising conclusions and was able to be used in maybe with another department or something?
yeah, we worked with an early stage company, where they had a vision and they had an execution strategy, and they wanted to go down this and increase engagement and start to measure engagement and really focus on building a sort of paid subscription service. And um, they were already sort of funded, very, very, very extremely ready to go down this path. And what we were able to uncover pretty quickly is that you don't really have any engagement. It's very, very low. So there's no point of talking about actually optimizing or trying and improving any of this. It's not sort of working. And within a few months they pivoted completely and moved towards a completely different model, away from a paid subscription service, more into a completely different business. And that was something which came as a byproduct. It's not something we weren't actively evaluating the business and giving them strategy, but by having the capabilities of seeing what's actually happening, they were able to potentially save themselves a year of a failed endeavor.
What would you say the qualitative or quantitative cost would be of companies who don't pay attention to harvesting their data?
I think
What
it's
could happen?
I think qualitative and quantitative cost is that they probably won't exist in 5 years. Because when your competition is doing this and your competition gets very sophisticated on understanding its customers and how they're using and what they want, and you are unable to do this, you might have a better product now, but it's incredible how quickly companies can move and play catch up. And not having these capabilities is like not having a website. It's like betting on not having a website and re-going through the last 10 years.
Yeah, for sure. And I get, for us, so we're a smaller company, and obviously everything we do is very manual right now because that's what makes sense. So I guess let's, normally we talk to those mid to big size companies, but let's take a moment and talk to the small company.
Yeah.
When should a small company start seriously considering investing in technology beyond what the applications they buy already offers up, right? They all
Yeah,
offer some level of reporting, but it's just not integrated.
sure. So, using applications makes a lot of sense to get started, right? You're an e-commerce business, we want to use Shopify, we want to advertise, let's go use Facebook. What happens is once you start having multiple channels or multiple different vendors, and you start using Google and Facebook ads, you can't really compare apples to apples because they just show you whatever they want to show you. And they sort of calculate ROI in a different way, and you can't compare apples to apples. And that's a very dangerous thing because you don't really know what's happening anymore. And so, initially kind of getting started with applications is fine, but as soon as you're starting to get subtraction, you want to be able to answer questions holistically and answer questions across different sources. So an example of that is assuming you have a sort of product return and you're an e-commerce business,
Mhm.
what percentage of the customers who had a return actually ever ordered from you again? If this is a super difficult question to answer if you don't have an integrated system. You'll have to look at your return system, manually get those customers, look at your order system, extract that, see how many of those customers ever ordered again. It's going to take you days, if not weeks. If you can't answer questions like this in like 5 minutes, it's going to really start affecting you, because for every idea you have, if it takes you 5 days to basically come up with that report, you're just not going to be able to validate different ideas. So I think, as you start, even as you start having multiple departments and you have a separate marketing department from a website department from a finance department, how do you kind of stitch some of these together so they're not just making decisions in silos? That's the right time. And again, earlier it used to be it didn't matter if you wanted to do it; it was just so expensive to do. And it's now, it's becoming so much more practical and sort of cheaper, and sort of platforms like kind of sort of what we're trying to do at 5x, make it much easier, like 10, 5 to 10 times cheaper, which basically means that companies can start doing this much earlier.
Hmm. Yeah, that'd be very valuable. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. I'd love to hear like, what your top three recommendations are for companies when it comes to making data-driven decisions.
Yes, that's a great question. Um, I think my top three takeaways would be start earlier. You know, it's not, by the time you're looking to launch something, if you get into it, then the sort of ship is already sailed, and you are running 6 months behind. So, sort of start early. The sort of second would be is that there's a massive difference in like manually being able to sort of come up with these insights and doing it in an end-to-end automated fashion. One of them you can build on top of and build something scalable, and the other one you have to start from scratch. So like understanding what the difference in that is. And then I think the third one would be is I think kind of in some ways the third one would be around um, getting. I think the third one would be on using a sort of, getting started from scratch is very, very expensive. So in some ways, going and signing these contracts yourself, or, hiring a large engineering team is sort of expensive. And, this is not so much on like 5x, but they are going to be a bunch of, in, in the next, in the next 5 years, 90% of businesses are going to be on the modern data stack. So very naturally, they are going to be sort of solutions like what we're trying to do, or other ones, which make it really easy to get started from scratch. And I think a big recommendation would be, unless you're a die-hard tech company like like Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, um, external solutions are going to be extremely valuable in moving quickly and being able to sort of and be able to get to data-driven insights. It's like, I sort of read this quote where it's like 5 or 10 years ago, marketing was no longer about making a post on Instagram. There's a lot more which goes into it. In that same way, uh, being data-driven is no longer about, getting a BI, sort of getting Tableau and building a few dashboards. There's a lot more which goes into it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Tarush, this has been a very interesting conversation. If folks wanted to find out more about what 5X does or connect with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, you can find us on our website at 5x.co. Again, that's 5x.co. You can reach out to us at hello@5x.co. We're all over social, so whether that's LinkedIn or Twitter, and yeah, looking forward to sort of helping. Um, sort of looking forward to like chatting data. And Jana, thank you so much for having me on the show, and hopefully we were able to add some value to your audience.
Yeah, thank you. To our listeners, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.